actually spinning up the tunes. But we got a great panel for you right now. I'm going to let actually Dale Allen actually introduce the guests, actually Ben Motz, actually Chris Brooks, and himself for this cool panel, actually. And Dale, actually, can I get you to introduce yourself?
Sure. I will do that. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, sure can.
I want to say I have no dancing skills compared to Neil. That's the first thing you need to understand. And actually, we'll kind of pick it up and take over with a little introduction and kind of roll through and try to move it forward. I'm going to share just some slides to use for informational purposes only. You can see that all right?
Yeah, we definitely can.
Great. So my name is Dale Allen. I'm the president and co-founder of the DXtera Institute. DXtera Institute is a nonprofit consortium of colleges, universities, and other partners around the world who are interested in addressing integration barriers to accelerate educational success. You'll see a sense of the logos on the screen, from community college systems to folks that are at the larger end of institutional settings, as well as companies and international partners. Our priority areas, we focus on creating open and shared technology solutions that are focused on next generation education systems, plug and play student information systems that are more open and deployable and more efficient, data management solutions, and as I said before, integration solutions that can be reused amongst our members, as well as open solutions. I'm very pleased to be here today as a partnering organization with DXtera, as an advocate for how do we use data to advance human learning, in particular to address equity gaps. At the last panel, the funders, and even throughout the whole day, we're addressing these issues. And so I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to ask my two colleagues to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Chris, and then we'll go to Ben. So we'll each get a chance to talk for just a little bit. Chris.
Thanks for that, Dale. Hi, I'm Chris Brooks. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Michigan. I'm a computer scientist by background. I do a lot of machine learning in education, kind of primarily focused on educational data mining and learning analytics. Interested in the ties between theory and data, improving theory through data and experiments, and sometimes post-hoc analysis as well, and building next generation tools with a combination of data mining and AI to support learning.
Great. Ben, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Dale. And thank you, Chris. And thank you, Neil. And thanks everybody for being here. My name is Ben Motes. I am from Indiana University, where I direct the e-learning research and practice lab. And I also have a faculty appointment as a research scientist in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. I guess I do two different things. I have original research that basically is, I don't know, you might imagine it to be like experimental psychology, but done in classrooms. So I'm extremely excited and fond of doing experiments on students, of course, with all sorts of protections and transparency around the ethics of that. And in addition to doing that, I found myself increasingly relying on data systems that are coming out of our e-learning infrastructure. So in my role as the director of the e-learning research and practice lab, I build bridges between these, our technology ecosystem and the associated data, and research faculty who are interested in answering theoretical questions using that data. So I'm very interested in the themes of, how we might democratize access to data from learning platforms and how to make good use of it.
Great. And to get us back here, so since Thursday and throughout today, it's been quite interesting to hear people talking about this critical importance of technology and people, and all of it to advance human learning. And behind all of that is how do we utilize data to move things forward in a way to address that and just spur innovation in the marketplace. I wanted to start with kind of setting the landscape that we deal with. So DXtera works with education enterprise systems. And whether you're at an individual college, whether you're in the K through 12 space or post-secondary, or as we just were talking about in the last panel, the adult learning space, everyone utilizes some sort of systems, enterprise systems or student information systems, learning management systems. I would also add in here CRMs. to collect data, again, very detailed micro level data, whether about assessment and performance, and wanting to get access to all of that data is extremely complicated. In almost all cases, that data is held by proprietary systems that sit, as we always like to say, in silos. And so across an individual educational entity, they have their own silos, and then you have a university environment with multiple silos, and then you have a state system or a national system in some of our EU countries and partners, where they have systems and silos that make it very challenging to aggregate and access data, let alone the policy and legal restrictions for the different age groups that were being discussed earlier. But in all cases, most of that data becomes very narrow, and that it's focused on a very specific set of information about a student, about a teacher, about an employee, whatever it may be. At Dextera, we tend to think of things as we'd love to be able to give people access to the wide data, so that all the data about a student or predicting a student's performance or teacher's performance or helping to develop new tools using data to train algorithms, we want to make sure it's as wide as possible and as open as possible. And I know both of my colleagues deal with these issues of their different systems that they're dealing with. So I want to start there with kind of setting some context and getting an understanding of, we're going to use some question prompts on the screen, but I want to stress to everyone here, please use the chat function to submit questions, and we will be monitoring that and trying to answer. We want this to be informal and interactive whenever possible. So with that, I'd like to make sure that I go in the right order here. So I'd like to turn to Chris to see if, Chris, you can share a little bit about the different systems that, and how you're unlocking data and access to that data across your institution. And then we'll move to Ben to talk about not only his institution, but systems as well.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things that we've done at the University of Michigan, and I can't take credit for them, but I can describe them. And so one of those is actually a super wide data set, and it's called the Learning Analytics Architecture, LARC. And you can actually just Google this if you're interested. UMich LARC, because you can see the whole data dictionary, and it's several thousand columns wide, single flat file. And this was done intentionally to empower education researchers at the institution, the faculty, to understand what's going on in classrooms. You still have to have some knowledge, you have to be able to pull it into Excel, but it really takes all of the information we have in our student information system, all of the information that we have in our course results system as well, and merges it all together. The goal was not to cover everything, but to cover 80%. If we can let people answer their own questions 80% of the time, we could actually increase the energy and vibrancy on campus with educational research. And I think it's been quite powerful for us. At the same time, one of the things that we've done at the University of Michigan is invested heavily in the IMS Caliper and Caliper related tools. And so IMS Caliper is a specification that we helped write that software vendors like, let's say, Canvas, can adhere to. And this means that when they generate data, they start to push this data in a very specific format. We now have over 1 billion events in this IMS Caliper format, and they come from a variety of tools. And that's the beauty of this system, is it actually transcends some of the tool boundaries. What's interesting from a research angle is that we're now starting to write our research tools to generate this kind of data, so that immediately it becomes something that's queryable and relatable to the other data about it. So it immediately helps the researchers understand what exists. Both of these address different aspects of the data generation, if you will, pipeline when it comes to educational data. One is about democratizing access and starting investigations, and the other is about getting that fine-grained data, that very narrow data, into a format where we can very quickly take it wide and disseminate it to those who might be interested.
Great, thank you. And Ben, when we go to you as well.
Yeah, like Chris, I think that I've been the benefactor of my own institution, Indiana University's general spirit decor. I'm sure that there's a better French way of pronouncing that phrase, but so people at IU who have been responsible for aggregating the data that's pouring out of our learning technologies. They've been responsible for aggregating it, and they've always envisioned it as being potentially fruitful for researchers. It's just been a challenge to figure out how they make that connection. So yeah, we have our own, massive institutional warehouses that for pretty much as soon as they were starting to be populated with, for example, the Caliper event stream, these were things that people thought researchers should be able to gain access to, but just never knew how. So I think that one of the big keys to unlock this data at IU has been that we've presented use cases that have started conversations. So a big benefit to, I don't know, to just spreading around the possibility that there are data resources available for researchers is that sometimes researchers will bite. So I've bitten, and I've managed to find other people who've bitten that have really pushed the envelope in terms of what the privacy restrictions are, what the protocols might be to make it accessible, so that we can talk constructively about how to make it so that researchers get access to these learning data to answer questions, as opposed to just kind of sequestering it in the data warehouse, always thinking that it'll be something that we deal with later. Chris also and we also share another benefit of being in the Unison consortium. So the Unison consortium is a multi-institutional effort at doing kind of the same thing, acknowledging that we've all got similar data silos and that we could potentially gain some benefit of scaling. So the Unison data platform is a realization of this vision. It's a massive data model that brings in data from SIS and from the LMS and from other tools that squirt out to using the Caliper standard, for example. And yeah, it does actually make it so that maybe there's possibilities of developing processes around gaining access.
Great, thank you. And just for people's information, Unison is 19 or 20 institutions all collaborating on these kinds of things, correct?
Yeah. It's funny, it changes all the time. But yeah, and it's also got multiple campuses. But yeah, maybe something like 15 university systems.
Yeah, and I'll stay away from John Whitmer's comments about you being bit by a dog. I don't think we need to go down that road today. Never mind.
John doesn't bite either. Yeah.
No, he doesn't. He is a researcher, but he's tenacious. I know that. So maybe with Chris again, maybe we start with you again about this idea of how can we use open data to improve the student learning outcomes and address equity gaps in education. Again, a big focus. The discussion is really about getting AI tools to access and develop solutions to address student learning outcomes. So I'll turn to you first, and then we'll go to Ben.
Yeah, I was really privileged to run a workshop at last year's Learning at Scale that looked at how we might build tools to support diversity of learning. And I ran that with Renee Kizelchuk from Cornell and Nia Dowell from UC Irvine. And it's a huge problem. What we know about in detail at Michigan are Michigan students, and that just gives us a slice of understanding. But what I'm often interested in as a researcher is not just better empowering Michigan students, but empowering students everywhere. There's a lot of different approaches that we've used for this. One of those approaches is consortiums, right? Where we can enter into permissive data sharing agreements. This is actually really expensive. There's a lot of, I know many more lawyers on campus than I would ever have thought that I would know. But it's highly beneficial. There are, I guess, other approaches to this. So some institutions have the ability to make some of their data actually fully open or pretty open. I'm gonna throw out props to Stanford, which has done a great job with their data stage at making whatever they can available. But I think we have to look outside of education for the best examples of this. And I think we need to look at healthcare, and we need to look at some of the privacy stuff that's coming out of the big tech industry. So I'm going to point on one piece of technology or one set of approaches that I know there's a workshop actually here about as well at AAAI, and there'll be lots of papers on. It's kind of a hot darling right now, which is federated learning. The idea that you can take data that's sensitive, you have to keep inside your enclave, things like your typing, whatever you're typing on your phone, and you can build predictive models on that data. But then to build diversity of that model, to incorporate the changes from others, you can also start to share some of the model parameters, some of the training instances up to a higher level model. And so you can build both local models and global models. And you can imagine this actually happening within a single campus, where a department might have some predictive model of how their students will do. I'll take a very common educational predictive model use case. Then the school might have that, and then the whole university might have that. And so you might have these different models at different levels. There's a lot of work being done at this, and I'm certainly not the expert in AI under this area of federated learning. And the opportunity exists for us to be able to leverage that and to be able to move that across even some of these alliances. And that has two benefits. So first, we can do it to understand nuance and diversity and build models across that. But two, we can also do that without having to all share the exact same vendors. So one of the challenges when we decide that we're going to go with a vendor and we get their data stream and their event stream is then we're kind of locked into that, and everything we model is based off of that. Some consortia like Unison have intentionally gone with a single vendor for the whole consortium. Others have not and want to keep that diversity of vendor and allow new vendors to be able to come in and new players to come in. And I use vendor very broadly here because I'm also including all the homegrown tools that we build, sometimes that have no commercial version or eventually are intended to compete with that. And federated learning allows us, or the promise anyway of federated learning, is to be able to build some of our predictive models across these different contexts. It's used, so I gave this keyboard example, but it's also used in medical imaging. That's another place where it's being used, where the detailed images are highly confidential, but we still want to be able to more globally understand, how to detect cancer and so forth. So that's one place where I think it's not just open data per se, but it's looking at the approaches that are being used in the area of AAAI broadly and thinking about how which ones we want to pull across into the field of education. One last plug I'll put in here before ceding over to Ben is vendors have really interesting stacked verticals. And so we might work with a lecture capture vendor and they have hundreds of universities working with them, but they know nothing about the learning management system. They know nothing about the student information systems. They know nothing about these. It's still very piecework. We need to find ways to share that data. And so this is where I'll come back to standards and specifications like Caliper. They're not perfect, but they're one way that we can encourage our partner vendors to try and give data in a way that's meaningful and translates across some of the learning activities.
Great. And Ben, just before we come to you real quickly, so one of the key takeaways I'm hearing, and we'll come back to this later, is this notion of it's really hard for an educational entity with its products that it's chosen to use to be able to share data without the interoperability that Brian Richardson stressed in the last panel, and you're just giving another example of. So we'll come back to that, I'm sure, later on. Ben, you want to put some key points on this one as well?
I think I agree with Chris. He's not somebody who I would disagree with lightly, but I think he actually happens to be right objectively. Yeah, I think that the undertone or the unspoken thing here is that you can't just rely on people to create a federation of the willing, because then you're going to get really wild biases in the data that happen to be available for analysis. So I'm an experimental psychologist. I run experiments in classes. And if I only were able to measure things in the classes that were willing to sign up for this, I would see a very strange and weird set of patterns. So by having these standards, by having everything that Chris has already talked about, then all of a sudden I can start recruiting from classes that would normally not be so excited to do this. and explore the generalizability of our inferences across the sorts of settings that we actually would hope our inferences would generalize across.
Yeah, and I'll just stress that in the chat, there's a sidebar going on about people, how deeply are people actually using some of the standards that are out there, kind of applying a caliper or any other one. And it is a wild west. It's varied. It gets back to your point. Let's keep moving through. We got a couple more just prompt questions. Again, any other questions you want to put them right in the chat. But Ben, let's start with you this time. Can you talk about kind of the benefits, and an example, you see the benefits of posting analysis code publicly?
Yeah. So it goes on two different levels. Thus far, we've been talking about like the responsibilities that an institution might have to share their code, or to at least have standards so that people can access the code and be able to do things in ways that extend across their own little narrow silos. But I think that responsibility could also be applied to the individual researcher. So let's say that you happen to be lucky enough to gain access to some data that might otherwise be private or protected, and you're able to do research with it. There's a lot of benefit to then expressing that more broadly and sharing it, and also the things that you produce to analyze that data. So there's lots of benefits to this sharing. I mean, I imagine that for a lot of the people in the audience, if you haven't already gotten in the habit of sharing your analysis code publicly, it might seem like a terrifying thing to do. But yeah, like, why would I share all the possibilities for people to scrutinize my mistakes and stuff? But let me assure you, it's actually a good thing to do. And to the extent that there might be a problem, usually when people find problems in something that you've shared openly, they tell you about it in constructive and helpful ways. It's not something that people are throwing stones at you for. So repositories for this are plentiful. There's protocols.io. I'm especially fond of osf.io. One of the benefits specifically to doing this is that you get to be a maven. So let's say that you actually have some, I don't know, some a priori reason to promote a particular way of analyzing, I don't know, a particular data set. You can make your way of doing it the public de facto way of doing it just by sharing your code publicly. So I don't know, I'm especially fond of Bayesian estimation, and I get to preach my Bayesian estimation gospel by showing everybody else how to do it and sharing my code. Another advantage you get to this that I'm sure that Chris is about to mention too is that you actually can get consensus on how we measure things. So let's say that we're interested in measuring time on task in a tutoring system or something. There's many different ways of measuring time, especially when you're looking at web analytics. And if we can come to consensus on feature engineering, maybe it can be more of a science than an art.
Great. Chris, would you like to add into this?
Yeah, there's so much actually here between what Ben said and what John said in the chat that I just want to dive into. But I want to pick up on one of the last things that Ben said, which was, I love Bayesian estimation, and I get to show people and sort of evangelize for that as a method. And I think sometimes we don't realize that as scholars in the field, we're role models for other scholars, for people who are coming through. And we have a chance to make this educational as well as sharing our results. And sharing your code is an amazing way to do it. And we see this happening over and over and over again. Again, in the AI community, in the computer science community, with people sharing their code. And that leads to quick, rapid turnarounds and people scrutinizing it. And again, it's humbling, but when you start to do it, and it becomes the norm in a community to be doing that, it becomes a friendly place where people are constructive about it. But it also becomes a place where you don't have to wait and wonder how I did X. You can just look at how I did X, and you can poke it and you can play with it. So there's this whole education component to open code that I think is just incredible, that we don't talk about it as much. But I wanted, one of the other things I wanted to touch on is instrumentation. And so it's not just our analysis code that needs to be made publicly available, but it's also our instrumentation. And John brought up a really powerful point in the chat that I've also seen, which is often the people who are building the instruments are computer scientists, programmers who don't necessarily know much or anything about learning. And in research, sometimes they're an undergrad who's doing it for various reasons. Maybe we're paying them, maybe they get credit for it. I don't know, but they might not know anything about the theory that we're trying to capture evidence of. And so what that leads to is a lot of instruments that are questionable, and a lot of instruments that may measure something, but we overstate that in our paper as we're trying to write for generalization. And so a great example are social social network models that are built off of discourse data. Discussion forums in education are extremely variable. There's so many different wonderful different discussion forum systems. There is no way, I believe, that students interact with each one of those the same. Yet when you read the paper, that context is generally wiped out. And it's, we use the institutional LMS or we use Slack, and each one of these, we don't know what's rendered on the screen. And there's so much that plays into that with individuals. Just think about some of the systems that you use and how the really useful ones you use in slightly different ways. I think that this is a huge problem for us, and so we need to start moving towards more open systems so that we can start to set some baselines.
So I'll just maybe hit some key points that I heard just real quickly, because it's really the core of who Dextera is as well. We think the power of community is what brings about innovation and acceleration into the market. And that adoption that comes by users as well as technical people working together to address the issue. And again, we focused on building connectors to solve an integration problem that are reusable and shareable. And we have a set of specifications with which we do it all by, but it needs to be seen and understood by everyone else to be improved. And it's exactly how we try to approach it as you just described it here. Let me keep us moving through. One more kind of big question for both of you. And then again, we really are interested in hearing from others or questions that you might have. But as we've been listening, in particular, I've been listening throughout the day, but Neil's question earlier, the last session, and even the futurist this morning, talked about, what do we imagine in the future if some people are thinking that the largest company is an AI education company that we haven't heard of yet in 2040, that's going to be changing the way we do business and see things. What do you guys think about in terms of the challenges and kind of what do you see in the near future for using data to advance human learning? And let me go to Chris first, then Ben, just to keep us not stepping on each other. I knew I'd screw that up eventually, Ben. So Chris.
So I'm going to actually tie in what was talked about at the last panel. So in the last panel, there was Amy Baylor said, we've got money, we want to have an institute on adult learning. I'm actually not sure what adult learning is. I've got conceptions of it, right? And we also heard this from IES. We can't give the money away from adult learning. I think higher education is really in a frustrating spot to me with respect to what we believe about our students and what we believe about student data. And we don't see this in a lot of other systems. So for instance, in the healthcare system, I can use HIPAA, I can request all of my data. If I want to go to the government, I can request the data that they have about me too, under various kind of privacies and FOIA requests. In fact, if I go to Google, I can use Google Takeout to access all of my data. If I go to Amazon for my fitness band, I can access that data. But as a student coming to the university can't access their data. And I think, I'm just going to kick this can hard and then send it over to Ben, but I think that we need to be thinking in our institutions as educators about the paternalistic nature in which we treat students and their data. And we need to question whether that's actually in the best interest of their learning, or if it's just easy or comfortable to do that. And that's especially in the United States. So I'm Canadian, coming from Canadian universities, I see a slight different approach to that and to the agency with learners as adults being the norm, because it's everybody outside of K-12 essentially. Mm-hmm. And I question whether, especially with so many learning opportunities that are outside of higher education, Coursera, edX, boot camps, etc., whether we are actually doing the right thing with that perspective. And I'd like to see us tackle that as a community, because there's lots of sensitive data locations that seem to be able to give it to the users without the world ending.
Yeah, and Ben, let me just interject before you jump in here. On that point, there are communities that have formed, and there are international standards bodies working on this issue as well. And there's many companies producing things that could access or want to access kind of a learner controlled record. And a vision we bring with others, and you just kind of hit on it, is how do you give students the agency to control access and utilization of all of their educational data as they see fit, just as we are doing in every other environment. And it's above policy in many cases, but it really is about the practice and the technology to enable that. So there is discussions, but we need to pull it together back in here as well. Ben, what are your thoughts on the future challenges in the future to use data to advance human learning?
I'm gonna just kind of like continue to kick this can that Chris kicked. It's like we're taking a gentle stroll down the street and we're kicking the same can maybe. Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I feel like you're saying that, for example, IU has a chief information security officer, but maybe instead it should be like the chief information liberation officer or something. Like we just need to stop thinking about everything on lockdown and start thinking about utilization. Is that?
And it's a teachable moment, right? Like we're made for this, right? To
Yep.
give learners their data, to give them that agency, to help them develop skills, to interrogate that data, ask questions about it, to turn them into data-informed citizens. You could tell I teach data science, and then to let them better their lives.
Yeah, so I agree. And I think that maybe like to the extent that I'm envisioning there being challenges in this space, it's around this issue of, making sure that we actually are doing the hard work of not just making it available, but also making it available to the right people. So one of my biggest challenges that I have when I'm trying to build a bridge between our data infrastructure and people who would actually make responsible, rigorous use of it is helping those people who would make responsible, rigorous use of it know about it and know how to use it. So there's not really clear, crosstalk between the data engineers and the research faculty. And sometimes research faculty have become research faculty because they're really comfortable doing research with data that are already available to them and not this new stuff. So helping them to understand the opportunities for external validity and for authenticity is especially important. And moreover, being able to do research, again, at scales where it's not just the places that are convenient or the places that would otherwise volunteer to make the data available, but in places where it would be inconvenient, so that we can generalize our inferences beyond those tidy pockets where we already might have convenient access. If you're on like the learning engineering listserv, you'll see that I've been kind of like a thumper for this new paper that's out there. And if you haven't already heard of it, you should go check it out, on the generalizability crisis. So the idea is that perhaps when we do our science, we're making inferences well beyond the level of the actual covariates that might describe the pockets where those inferences might work. So we'll say, hey, we can predict this from this, but maybe we can only actually do that with this small 50% sample of the population, and the other 50 is just a Wild West. So being able to, liberate our data effectively so that the right people can get their hands on it, so that they're using data efficiently as opposed to just at the most coarse level possible.
That's great. And I think I would add, one thing that I see, and it gets back to the individual learning record and the capability to share, is really the, it's funny, my PhD is actually in economics and public policy. So I always think about things as a market and a market-driven kind of solution. And I really see the ability and interest and the need for institutions. If you start with the individual learner, if you start with teachers, if you start with the administration or the systems that they end up having, the researchers in between, and then companies outside of that or the government, the choice I want to make with my data and to have the ability to plug and play any product or research tool to use that data. Again, protecting privacy, but giving agency to the student. So for me and for what we think about at Dextera, it's all about that control and agency and removing those barriers. And as we come to an end, we have a few minutes left. I did want to kind of relate it to this vision for the future and kind of maybe tying together a bunch of these thoughts. One thing we've been collecting a community around and growing with friends like Riiid Labs and Riiid and others that you see on the screen is really around how can we do some of these things as communities of practice? How can we be involved in more research that can start to bring about innovation in the marketplace, but really can address this infrastructure issue, which does get at the practice and policy as well. But how can we create open infrastructure? So if I'm an educational entity, I want to be able to share my data from that LMS, from that SIS. Can I actually utilize an API-based infrastructure to share that data where I want and when I want, so that we can have large open data sets that could also be supplemented with, so you want to take all of Hawaii's historical data and have it de-anonymized in a manner that is appropriate and usable, or anyone else's, and we can start to bring it together or disaggregate it as we see fit, that we can use data simulation to bring that about, so that we can then spur challenges, like we heard earlier with the AI Ed challenge, to use different types of data sets to address micro and macro questions that are really about education performance and optimizing performance for all, not for some. And to really get at some of this post-COVID response things that now have to be paid attention to more than before. And a real shared goal between funders and partners in a growing way, where we can take and think about the data, the research questions, or the company who's trying to create an AI algorithm or machine learning or a tool that would actually have a huge difference to be made in the market, and to help support the development and deployment of that. And so as we look at the future of using data to optimize learning and performance, we think communities of practice, community activity, open shared infrastructure specifications, research, data is critically important. And so we are collaborating with anyone who wants to do more of this in a manner that will hopefully benefit the shared community who is using AI to address these inequities in education. With that, I'll see if there's any other comments from my colleagues or panelists, Ben or Chris, if you want to add anything as we close. If not, I'll see if Neil does, but I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat as of right now either.
By the way, actually, thank you very much for the three of you. Actually, I think that's a great conversation, getting you guys talking about actually data sets, and Chris even talking about actually sharing code, and it seems very appropriate given that we just had this big data release that actually we just had a competition around. And also actually that Riiid is actually releasing all of that code for all the winners. And so it's a good day for open science. I don't know if actually Dale, actually you want to address actually Michelle, actually just put something in there. Did you want to, or?
Sure. So the question in the chat that Michelle just, and Ben, I'm going to call on you first since you've already started to type a response to her. So the challenge of understanding from the data context in which the learner is situated. Instrumentation often is built to collect what is easy to collect, and it usually tells only a small portion of the overall story. Ben, what do you think?
I think Michelle's right. And yeah, it is. And so, yeah, it's true. It's hard. And in our own simple ways of looking at it, like you can imagine recreating the context perhaps from the user data. So we could do clustering on the types of user data that are out there so that we could maybe infer some differences in the landscape of different learner contexts. So there's tricks to being able to get around it, but in general, I would say that those tricks would not stand up to criticism. And I think that you're correct that this is one of the most important things that we could be looking at, especially considering that any of the patterns that we're analyzing are fundamentally tied to the implementation. So if we're going to be actually making precise predictions about how AI or how any data tool could support learning, it's really going to rely on us having a better description of those contexts.
Yeah, excellent question, Michelle. Thank you. And Ben, thanks for the response. Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the problems with having the instruments completely hidden is it means you can't interrogate them at all. And so the context, then you miss clues that you could use to actually understand that context. Context is a great word because it's basically a free variable. It could mean anything, right? From the demographics of the student to what was rendered on the screen when they were looking at something. But without even having an idea, when you're just told it's the time they looked at the thing, you don't know if that was an eye tracker or if it was dwell time on a web page or if it was on a mobile device on a bus. And these are all hugely different, and it makes it impossible to replicate, impossible to interrogate. And so then everybody just rolls their own. And that's why we never have two papers that have the same kinds of measures in them. And it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, great question.
And by the way, Chris, I'm not sure if you want to drop in the chat, actually, the journal that actually I think Ryan Baker and you're probably associated with, the context. Actually, I was just trying to Google for it and I couldn't remember it precisely. But anyways, with this said, actually, can everyone actually help me thank the speakers, actually, and the moderator? I appreciate everyone actually doing so.